Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Jurisprudence podcast with me, Alex.
And me, Charlotte.
And what are we talking about today?
Uh, a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of politics of criminal punishment.
Okay, fair enough. We've titled this one Pressure, Politics, and Populism. I say we, I mean you, because you're the one that's done all of the research for this.
Yeah.
So, really, the main focus, from what you've told me, is this idea of penal populism. And essentially, as a sort of rundown, what we'll do is talk about penal populism, talk about why it's important to understand and to potentially combat,
Yeah.
and then see how we can link this together by looking at some of the news that we've seen in recent days. The early release scheme under the Labour government, as well as the sentencing of Hugh Edwards.
Yeah.
And the sort of implications, political or not, to do with that.
Yeah.
Essentially. Okay. So, I guess my first question then is, if we want to know what penal populism is, it probably should be pertinent to ask the question about what populism is.
Yeah.
So what is populism? How would you define populism?
I would say that populism is sort of a strain of political thought where the appeal is to the ordinary person, and it's about the denigration of this class of elites that has sort of been exercising their power over the people, and it's kind of an appeal to Middle England, the ordinary working person, and what people need in their everyday lives. It's that sort of policy, the appeal of that kind of policy.
So it's a collection of ideas, really. It's a way of defining a sort of collection of ideas and collection of policies, and it is sort of this sort of us versus them mentality, and often with an us versus them mentality, it doesn't really strike much of a pragmatic role. It's not really asking the question. So asking the question of what are the pragmatic, practical realities of having this policy being implemented. It's, does this policy represent you, the ordinary person, or are these elites? Or are these elites trying to put you down, or this or that? Yeah, go on.
I think the sort of motivation behind it from people, because it's very emotive perspective, and it appeals to people in this way because you sort of hear it and you think, oh well, yeah, that applies to me. I want my politicians to represent me and my interests. And when the rhetoric goes, we want to effect change for the ordinary working person, that strikes to the heart of a lot of people. And like you said, it doesn't necessarily have any practical implications, because like dividing that up into actual effective policy, numbers on a page, etc., is very difficult.
Yeah.
So things like if anyone watched the debates before Labour got elected, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer were having their debates, and Rishi Sunak constantly made this sort of rebuttal, like, you're going to raise everyone's taxes.
Yes.
That's a populist retort, because it's basically saying everyone is going to hurt in their pocket because this elite politician is going to make stupid decisions that is going to hurt everyone, hurt the ordinary working person.
Exactly, yeah. And I guess from a global perspective, you're thinking about elections that are up and coming. One of the most clear-cut examples of sort of populism is Trumpism, isn't it? The sort of policy, I say policies loosely, of Donald Trump, because
is Trumpism a word?
I think so. Yeah,
Trumpism is that now a thing?
Yeah, I think so.
I like
it's sort of a collection of ideas relating to the sort of policies of Donald Trump. But if you watched the recent debate between him and Harris, you won't actually find a coherent policy or a coherent platform or manifesto. It's just talking about immigration. It's
Mm.
talking about things that are going to try and that are going to try and strike at the heart of the average voter, try and like get to the really their greatest fears and all these kinds of things.
Yeah, the emotive appeal of populism is exactly that. It strikes to the deepest wants and fears of the sort of average bland kind of conception of a person in that particular jurisdiction.
Exactly. And so within that sort of us versus them dialectic, you have this idea known as penal populism, which is what? Essentially just applying that to criminal justice.
Well, yeah, there's a very nice segue, because when you say that it appeals to the sort of heart and fears of the ordinary person,
Mm-hmm.
one of the great things that emerged out of the big spike of crime in sort of the 80s was fear of crime.
Yeah.
And so everyone doesn't want to be, criminally victimized.
No.
And therefore, when a politician says, oh, we're going to be tough on crime, we're going to be tough on the causes of crime, that again is a populist rhetorical device to strike at, people's deepest interests in terms of criminal reform.
Exactly.
People don't want crime to happen.
Exactly.
And so it's a very easy thing for people to say. So, penal populism is a similarly very amorphous, indeterminate concept where it appeals to the ordinary public and features a juxtaposition of the people and the elite, favoring the idea of a more stringent enforcement of criminal law based on this perception that people want policies that are tough on crime.
Exactly. So, whereas there is a sort of collection of policies that you probably could point to as being sort of part of penal populism, they all share the characteristic of this sort of moniker, this sort of idea of tough on crime.
Yeah.
This is the sort of the idea that we're thinking of, and that can range from harsher sentences on the one hand to the death penalty on the other.
Yeah.
Essentially. And
arguably the harshest sentence.
Yeah, the harshest sentence being the death penalty, but from a penal populist perspective, that is one that is popular. It is one that does garner a certain amount of sympathy for certain crimes.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we've had this debate quite a few times whether you think that we would reinstate the death penalty.
I
given
100%.
If it went to a referendum, whether we would do it or not.
In the UK right now, the sort of current climate, if there was a referendum on whether or not to bring back the death penalty, I am 99% convinced that it would. The general population would vote on it. It's just so easy to campaign for, because what you would essentially say, if you're somebody who is going to be part of the pro death penalty campaign, is this is a insert criminal murderer, child murderer, rapist here. Do you really want this person to be in prison on taxpayers' money and to live out the rest of their life in relative comfort, or shall we just kill that individual? And that's a populist rhetoric. That's a populist talking point right there that I've just presented to you. And that would work. That would undeniably work.
See, that's very interesting, because the argument that you just proposed is one aspect of penal populism, and that is the interpretation of what people want, which is also a significant difficulty. This idea that the people actually do want harsher sentencing or harsher enforcement of crime isn't necessarily true. And while I'm sure we could debate until the cows come home whether there would actually be a positive outcome in terms of reinstating the death penalty, in terms of actually reinstating it. The idea that the general public is favorable towards capital punishment sort of stems from that problem with penal populism, and that is the difficulty of measuring public opinion.
Yeah.
So, a couple of sources that I've sort of gone into more detail in the blog post talk about the forms in which public opinion is measured in terms of quantitative surveys, might capture a certain snapshot in terms of public views regarding punishment, but that the methodology of disseminating these surveys and the way that the questions are asked actually might inform certain responses.
Okay.
So, specifically, the way that questions are formulated on opinion surveys, such that they suggest a certain inclination to the data subject. For example, do you think that sentencing is too lenient?
Yeah.
That kind of questioning might lead someone to say, well, yeah, this is going into research methods a little bit, but it's like imposing a positive response onto the person.
Exactly. Well, you're asking if it is too lenient.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, you're not framing that question in a sort of neutral way.
Yeah. But that's the problem with trying to research something like penal populism, is that you're characterizing your research and the thing that you're looking into as coming from a position of the people want more punishment.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, you might always end up framing your questioning or your research kind of focus towards that end, in which case you're constructing kind of that reality, if that makes sense.
That does make sense, but it's regardless of whether or not it's difficult to measure penal populism in the UK, for example, it nevertheless is prolific enough that it informs policy. You've said yourself in the debate between Sunak and Starmer before the general election this year that he was pushing very strongly a penal populist, a generally populist type of rhetoric. So, and generally speaking, I believe the Conservative Party as well as Reform also pushed quite penal populist ideas.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So,
well, Reform specifically is a populist party.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, regardless of whether or not people actually want tougher sentencing, it seems to be the case that a number of the major political parties that won a number of votes, quite a significant percentage of votes, were of the belief that people did, if that makes sense. So it still nevertheless is very prevalent, regardless of what measuring it difficulties might bring up. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yeah. I think in terms of measuring public opinion, it's more about having a nexus between the actual policies and what people actually want.
Mm-hmm.
So the people that have voted for those parties might not have wanted harsher sentencing, or they're not really sure what they wanted in terms of criminal policy, in terms of the sort of nitty gritty of it, but it still appeals to a broad brush kind of, this is what I feel should be done about crime.
Because I guess you could maybe make the point that if a populist manifesto said we want to be tough on crime, that's great, and I'm sure that would actually garner quite a lot of support from quite a lot of people. You probably get a majority of people saying that we should be more tough on crime.
Yeah.
But then when it actually gets to the brass tacks of it, the actual ideas themselves, well, tough on what crimes?
Yes.
How are we going to be tougher on crimes? Does this involve having to raise taxes to fund the construction of greater prisons? What kind of sentences does it? Do we say tough on crime in the sense that we want to impose, let's say, harsher financial penalties on some of the more smaller summary offences? That's technically tough on crime, isn't it? But that's not usually what we mean when we think about tough on crime. We normally think about longer prison sentences. Maybe some people say, I think another penal populist idea is that life in prison should mean life in prison.
Yes.
A life sentence doesn't mean a life sentence in the sort of colloquial sense in England and Wales. But some people might say, well, let's have a life sentence. But then those people would reject the raising of taxes necessary to
actually hold people in prison
for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there's a lot of things to think about there.
Yeah, it's quite interesting when, like you say, when you get down into the actual policies, that a lot of the ideas are contradictory, because
neither of us are penal populists.
Yeah.
Or populists at all. Let's be honest.
Well, yeah. Like your example of holding someone in prison for life would cost more.
Yes.
So
more.
Raising taxes is obviously not going to appeal to the ordinary person, but that's why these kinds of things being said about being tough on crime, or, you know, that kind of thing, doesn't actually include policy.
So if we go back to the sort of death penalty example, which is obviously a populist idea, populist rhetoric, do you think that it's just the sort of intuitive, maybe visceral reaction that gets people supporting the death penalty, in the sense that they hear about horrendous crimes and they think that that person shouldn't deserve to live, essentially? But then if you said to a person that I believe it's something like 4% of all people on death row are actually innocent, and get executed regardless of whether or not they're innocent or not, because they're found to be guilty, and there are lots of examples where that happens. If you said to that person, you know, what percentage, how sure would you have to be before you execute someone, and they say, well, you have to be 100%. I was like, well, is it possible to be 100%? Their sort of idea or their positive support of the death penalty begins to shift slightly, in the sense that you then have the state executing people for no particular reason. And if you include other arguments against the death penalty, that sort of pushes them away from that idea. I've seen it myself, with people talking about it. So is it just a sort of visceral reaction, or is it something deeper?
I think that, to an extent, yes, because if you go back to the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned that it creates an us versus them kind of perspective, or it stems from a us versus them perspective, in terms of the ordinary person and the elite, and
which generally is seen as something of a mistrust of democratic processes, because if you're dividing us versus them, and you're sort of separating them, then you're sort of not recognizing the way in which us as the population elects and votes for them. If that makes sense.
That's actually a very interesting point.
That you're sort of an us versus them mentality implies that we don't have any say in that process. Some people argue that is the case, that, you know, it's lobbying, for example, is so prevalent, and that, you know, the shady elites, the richest in society, the ones that actually decide things in the background and all that kind of stuff.
That actually raises something that I was reading about the other day, about the decline of deference to politicians and people who are knowledgeable about policy making, economics, prisons policy, etc., etc. The reason why populist rhetoric has gained so much popularity is this sort of want for individuals to stake their own claim in their own lives. And I said earlier about when Thatcher came into power and she brought in neoliberalism and appealed to the individual working person.
Absolutely.
Did away with welfarism in the prison system, as well as generally economic welfarism, because there is no such thing as a society. People should support themselves.
It's just the individual.
The individual is king, basically.
Pull yourself up by the bootstraps, all that kind of stuff.
So, where was I going with this? The us versus them mentality. It also strikes to sort of defiant individualism in society, and bounces off of other things like anti-immigration and
which is a sort of an us versus them analogy
Yeah,
in and of
exactly.
itself.
Yeah.
Us being the citizens of the UK, them being people coming into the UK.
Yeah, and then that also bleeds into criminal policy as well when you see the blending of immigration law and criminal law, the targeting of small boat migrants for heightened enforcement of criminal law. This all sort of blends in together to strike to a more emotive response to people's fear or insecurities in their daily lives.
Yeah.
So if you hear, you know, people are coming in and they're dangerous, for example, and that's one of the reasons why these riots started,
Yeah,
because a rumor went around that person was a migrant.
Yeah, so these are the 2 points I was about to make.
Go ahead.
The points I was going to make is that, yeah, if you then mix that with another growing problem that we see with social media and misinformation, you find yourself in a situation where populism and penal populism becomes very difficult to combat. And it's not like we're just sat here talking about this, sort of waxing lyrical about the idea of penal populism, because this thing does actually have, like populism does, it has real consequences.
Yeah.
People like Trump get elected. People like Boris Johnson get elected. Things like Brexit happens. Or if you're talking about the situation that we're thinking of, that you just mentioned, the sort of the populism and the us versus them mentality behind the small boats, inverted commas, and mix that with a little bit of misinformation, and you find yourself having riots, significant riots across the UK for multiple days. Wasn't it a week or something? Well, quite a long time.
Exactly. It's the perfect storm for unprincipled criminal justice, which is something that I cannot bloody stand. Which is why my PhD is all about, going back to the heart of how we construct our principles in order to guide our decisions in policy making.
Yeah.
So this capitalizing on people's very valid insecurities in a difficult economic time, that kind of thing, where
mixing misinformation with that as well.
Yeah, mixing in misinformation, I think is very poor, and word, what is the word?
Poor and
like politicians. They're not being irresponsible policy making.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Because then obviously the popularity of populism grows, and yeah, like you said, this feeds into a narrative where, because we live in a democratic system, you need to get votes.
Yeah.
And so politicians are going to sort of lean into that more to get more votes. And then when they get votes, they're now basically becoming sort of audience captured by the policies that they used to advocate for to get them the votes. Now they sort of have to go along with that kind of narrative. They can't really get out from that.
Yeah.
And they find themselves in a situation where they're basically passing policy and believing in policy that probably will not work. That sort of stands in contrast to the empirical data on the issue of crime, the issue of punishment, the issue of recidivism, and all these different kinds of things.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes its own echo chamber, essentially.
Yeah.
To the point where all of the work that criminologists have done, or judges talking about effective sort of procedure and sentencing and that kind of thing, is sort of thrown by the wayside because we've caught ourselves up in a tangled web where we can't really extricate ourselves anymore. I'm just searching for my notes on what David Garland said about the role of criminologists in tackling penal populism, because he says something really interesting at the end of his article that I'm going to cite in the blog post. He talks about what's wrong with penal populism. And he essentially says that research is repeatedly shown, and then he has a massive list of facts of crime. The age crime curve means that offenders age in and out of crime. The criminal justice system is not a system of crime control. It is chiefly about apprehending and punishing individuals after the fact. We are not able to predict individual dangerousness, but we can identify the social conditions that produce elevated rates of violence. Hotspot policing can be effective and ethical. Mass stop and frisk cannot. And he goes on and says basically all of these products of criminological research over the years.
So,
and yet,
go on.
Sorry, this is lost because the policies that might come out of the research don't appeal to the very snappy, punchy, populist rhetorics that politicians want to use. What were you going to say?
I was going to say that, so, I mean, one of the things that we sort of know is that none of this stuff is new.
Mm-hmm.
We know things about crime. We don't need to know exactly why people commit crime, but we know broadly why people commit crime.
Yeah.
We know that things like education and poverty
Mm-hmm.
are associated with why people commit crime. We knew previously that things like lead in water is the reason why people committed there was a higher rates of crime, or at least that's one of the factors that might have been a cause of things like really high crime rates in the 1990s. We know all of this, and the problem isn't trying to work out why crime happens, or work out how we can reduce crime. We know, for example, that sort of gearing attention towards more rehabilitative forms of punishment lead to lower recidivism.
Yes.
And so all of these things are sort of basic facts, okay? No one's challenging these facts. And they're not, or at least they're not challenging those facts on the basis of them being incorrect. They're challenging them on the basis of populism. They're challenging them on the basis that that's treating criminals better than you're treating you as a person. We're treating the murderers, or we're treating immigrants, or we're treating this or that or these or the other people better than they're treating you.
Yeah.
That's essentially the populist idea. The problem isn't trying to work out where crime comes from. The problem is essentially taking what we know about where crime comes from and translating that into politics.
Yes.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Doing a sort of putting a politics language on it in a way that sounds palatable to get votes.
Yeah.
Which is why nobody likes to touch criminal justice or prison reform whenever there's a new election.
With a sort of fine, light touch.
Yeah.
Specifically.
Well, the only people that do want to touch criminal justice are the people who are the populists, who are saying, we need to be tougher on crime.
Yeah.
People who would have a more progressive approach to criminal justice reform don't want to go anywhere near it because they know it's a vote killer, basically.
But actually, I'm gonna say something quite surprising to you, at least, because when the elections were going on, I said, "Oh, I'm not too fond of the Labour policy on crime." I have since rescinded my opinion. Because I think the appointment of Timpson was a very good decision.
Yes.
And B, because I think what Labour did was very clever in terms of having a sort of broad brush, seemingly populist position, talking about more policing the beat, having
more bobbies on the beat.
Yeah, exactly. Seemingly populist, seemingly increasing a sense of security and appealing to sort of ordinary understandings of what crime enforcement should be. And yet he's done this, I don't know, depending on how it turns out, quite a good 180 by early release of prisoners.
Well, yeah. Well, before we get to the early release of prisoners story, the point, this is a point I believe Alistair Campbell made. I don't know if it was a point that he invented, but he thought that maybe the Labour manifesto is something akin to a Ming vase, in the sense that you're carrying it very, very gently to get it over the line to get to the election, and then when you put it down, you could be a bit more radical. It's essentially the point, and you see that with a lot of things. If you look at Starmer's position prior to the election on things relating to, for example, the war in Gaza, which was a very hotly, still is a very hotly dividing political issue, he sort of stays quite behind the line on it. He seems to be quite muted on that issue, to the point where a number of people that we know decided they're just not going to vote for Starmer because of that fact. And then since then, you've got things like the potential recognition of statehood. You've got the getting advice about potential violations of international law. You've got the banning of arms sales. All of these things weren't actually part of the manifesto, but the idea here is that they sort of stay muted on these issues until, just so they can get over the line, make sure that they definitely get into office, because I believe it's either Starmer or maybe even Tony Blair that makes the point that none of it matters unless you get into office.
Right.
You can come out and be as radical and be as progressive as you want, but if you don't get the votes, then it doesn't actually matter.
Yeah.
You are basically doing nothing. So that's one of the points that you can make about, potentially make about the Labour government, that they sort of appear to be a little bit more muted prior to the election, and now they're definitely in office, they've got the majority, they're in for 5 years, they're going to go and do some sort of more radical things.
Shake things up a bit. I think also, while he played quite a lot on his experience in the CPS,
as the Director of Public Prosecutions,
I feel like his background of being a lawyer and sort of being an embodiment of anti-populism. The manifesto and the sort of policies that they were putting forward at the time of the election tried to temper and appeal to a broader base because of that.
Get as many votes as possible.
Yeah.
And then do...
So I think that was quite clever.
So let's think about this. So what is the... I've not actually read that much about it. What is the early release scheme? Why is it popular? Why is it not popular? What's the pros and what's the cons? What do you think about this as a researcher in criminal justice?
So if you remember back in COVID,
yes,
they released some prisoners to sort of lighten the load on the prison system and sort of minimize the risk of spread and everything. They did something similar because the prison system is basically at capacity.
Yes.
And it has been for quite a long time. Yes. This has been like an on again, off again point of conversation in terms of, we don't have enough prison space. We need to build more prisons or stop sending people there.
Yes. This is a point that Rory Stewart and David Gork were very much in favour of when they were in office, the sort of more centre-right leaning conservatives within the government who definitely dictated the danger of the absolute capacity prison system that we currently have.
So this early release scheme was announced in July, and this I'm reading from the Guardian article right now because it's a little bit sort of unclear, and I think it's actually quite interesting to read how this is reported, and I'll say a little bit more on that in a minute. But they essentially cut the proportion that you have to serve behind bars by 10%.
Okay.
And that meant that more prisoners were eligible for release.
So it reduced the amount of time you need to serve by 10%.
Yeah.
And so those who were towards the end of their sentence could just be released.
Yeah.
Okay.
And some of these decisions are based on, like, you go in front of a panel and basically you show what you've done during your time in prison. There might be conditions on your release for probation.
It's like a parole board.
Basically. So you might have a curfew, or you have to see someone. Most likely you will have to see someone and check in with them. You have to, there might be work conditions, or sort of drug rehabilitation conditions, all of this kind of thing. So a lot of the reporting on this has been this idea of this is going to put strain elsewhere on the criminal justice system. So one article that I just clicked on says police are left to deal with the fallout of poorly planned early release of 1,700 prisoners. And this goes to the idea of these prisoners are going to wreak havoc on society.
Yes.
I pointed out earlier, one line in the early release articles says that a spokesperson reckons a third of them will reoffend.
Yes.
And I've pointed that out a couple of times to you because that annoys me.
Yes. Why does it annoy you?
It annoys me because the recidivism rate is roughly about a third anyway.
So the point they were making is that people who are released have a recidivism rate of about 1/3. Recidivism meaning reoffending, by the way. And so to suggest that, to say that these people specifically have a 30% reoffending rate is to sort of single them out as unique statistics.
Yeah.
When in reality they're not unique statistics. That's just the recidivism rate for release anyway.
Yes.
I don't get this idea of wreaking havoc on society as a sort of. I mean, I understand why it's politically advantageous to make that point, but I don't understand the sort of factual basis of that. Because if you're telling me that all the scheme does is reduce the amount of time served by 10%, then why does that 10% mean that these people who have been now released 10% earlier, why are they more likely to reoffend than somebody who serves an extra 10% of their sentence?
Yeah, they're not.
Are we assuming that last 10% of prison time is the 10% that you really do your rehabilitation?
It's the tipping point between going out and doing it again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That you're more likely to reoffend without that extra 10% than you are with. That makes no sense. It makes no sense to me as a statistic.
Yeah. Well, it's also just fundamentally untrue, because the idea that, recidivism of these people is about a third is consistent with the rest of the prison population.
Also, how could that statistic doesn't make any sense. How are you even able to measure the recidivism of these specific people?
No.
Once they've only just been released.
No, you can't.
You have to wait for them to commit crimes to measure their recidivism.
Well, the statistic is based on a generalization of people that are, over a period of time.
That's what I mean, though.
Yeah.
I see. What I'm saying is that if this article is making the point, we'll link the article in the description.
Yeah.
If this article is trying to make the suggestion that these 1,700 people who have been released early have a 1/3 recidivism rate, and trying to make the point that it's specifically these people, how are they able to even measure that if they've only just been released?
Yeah. Wild.
Yeah, have any of them even committed a crime yet since they've been released? It's been a few days, hasn't it?
That's also another good point. So what I said earlier about people being released based on conditions. Some of this was conditional on them being tagged for like house arrest or curfew monitoring purposes.
Yeah.
And the production and sort of gathering of these tags was left to a security contractor as
private company.
A public procurement contract between the Ministry of Justice and a company called Serco. And they just haven't given them enough tags, basically, for the amount of prisoners that have been released. So this is also a hot piece of news that there are prisoners being released that are not being monitored and therefore are more likely to reoffend because they're not being monitored, which also doesn't make any sense because that's not true.
How stupid? How stupid does... I mean, I know you're praising Starmer's government. I know you're praising the Labour government in this. Did they not think that this would be the thing that would happen? It doesn't matter if crime goes up or down. It doesn't matter, because all that's going to happen now is, for the next few months, everybody's going to be telling us about how they released prisoners.
Yeah.
And they let them out, and they did so incompetently, and these people are now reoffending, and all this different kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like, well, it doesn't make it. I don't know how. Obviously, the actual empirical data on this, which is what you're concerned in specifically, is probably that this is a good scheme. Would you say? And...
Well, yeah. I don't. It really doesn't make a difference whether people are released early. Like you said earlier, 10% earlier.
No.
It does not make a difference. But the highlighting within these articles around certain offenders have been convicted of domestic abuse crimes, for example. It's highlighting the idea that these are violent people that are going to go and hurt people because they've been released early, when really this scheme isn't doing more than what would ordinarily happen in the justice system.
And you could argue that this is just populist reporting.
Yes.
This is just populism, because what this is saying is that you've got people being released, they've not been tagged, some of them are domestic abusers.
Yes.
You've got the ordinary people, okay? The elites have just released these dangerous people out into the world, and they're going to attack you, and they're going to kill you, and they're going to kill your grandparents, and all these different kinds of things.
Yeah.
And all of this feeds into this populist narrative. It feeds into this narrative that, well, why are they being released? They should be kept in prison longer. They should be punished more severely.
They should serve out the entirety of their sentence.
Yeah, some of them shouldn't be released at all. They should be in prison for life. And things like, well, why are the prisons full? Let's make more prisons and put them in it. Let's deport people.
Yes.
Then we start getting into the sort of populism that relates to things like small boats, and then
and then it goes on and on.
It goes on and on, exactly. So that's one of the stories that,
and that really highlights the media's role, like you said earlier, in this perfect storm.
Yeah.
Media sensationalism and misinformation is a big problem when it comes to criminal justice policy.
Well, that's an episode in and of itself.
Oh really, yeah, well yeah. The Hall of Mirrors, where we'll do an episode called The Hall of Mirrors.
Yeah.
And talk about crime and media.
Yeah.
Because that's a module that I did in my degree.
Oh, I see.
It's a whole thing. But anyway, let's go on to Hugh Edwards.
Hugh Edwards. What's the story with Hugh Edwards? Again, I've not followed this one either. I've had my mind in international law world.
You've been a bit like me, living under a rock.
Yes, I've been living under a rock about Hugh Edwards. So, for those of you who don't know, Hugh Edwards used to present BBC News.
Yes.
Basically. That's all I know.
Yeah, so he was sentenced for making indecent images of children. Although I point out that the Secret Barrister made a very useful tweet highlighting that the law isn't very clear on this. He wasn't instrumental in those pictures coming about, but the mere fact of him downloading them meant that he was making them by law.
That's an ambiguity right there that can confuse people.
Yeah.
Because most people don't, well, obviously, most people aren't going to read the case itself.
Or the legislation.
Definitely not. Most people aren't really even going to read the news stories from cover to cover.
No.
So, if the title of the legislation or the charge that he's been sentenced with is making indecent images of children, the sort of implication there is that he is taking pictures or filming videos of children doing indecent things.
Yeah.
Not simply receiving already made footage of that nature.
Which is, yeah. horrible.
Yeah, exactly.
A different horrible than what people assume it is.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, the news around this is basically centering the fact that he was only handed a 6-month suspended sentence.
Okay, yeah, that's the controversy, that he wasn't put into prison.
And this is A, because he pled guilty.
Mm-hmm.
B, because it was at the limit of the sentencing power of the magistrate's court. So they can only hand out 6 months.
So that's the maximum sentence.
That's the maximum sentence at magistrates. As a side note, there was a policy last year where they upped the sentence that the magistrates could hand out temporarily to like 12 or 10 months or something like that, but then they reduced it again.
Okay.
So I might throw something out there about explaining that further, because that's a thing in itself as well. But currently he was handed a maximum sentence for the mode of trial, that is, which court he was heard in. And this is controversy because it's a suspended sentence. He's not actually serving prison time.
No.
And concerns are raised on behalf of victims. People think that it's an injustice to victims. Really, on both stories, the early release scheme and this, that people think people aren't serving long enough in prison.
And this really ties into another point about populism, this idea of us versus the elites. Hugh Edwards, the presenter of BBC News, the person that narrated the weddings and the funerals of Queen Elizabeth, is seen as the elites. The media, in this sense, the BBC, are the elites. They're at least instrumental in the sort of the world of the elites. So the idea here is that the world is run by people who abuse children, and this feeds into broader conspiracy theories.
Yes.
About the elite. And then when you have an example like this, you have an example of an individual who is convicted of things relating to children, and they are sort of conceived of as part of the elites, the media, the mainstream media, and they get what people conceive of as a less harsh sentence. This feeds into the populism. It goes further and further. It goes deeper and deeper. And then politicians like Tom Tugendhat made points as well, saying this shouldn't be allowed. We should make it a harsher sentence and all these different kinds of things.
So there's a scheme for appealing unduly lenient sentencing, and it applies to Crown Court sentences only. Some offenses have been added over the years, some terrorist offenses, some sexual offenses, including indecent photographs, but this is again only applicable to the Crown Court. So unfortunately, people have raised that even if you think this is an unduly lenient sentence, and the arguments that the judge made for the sentence included the mitigating factors of the fact that this is his first offense, that he submitted an early guilty plea, which takes a third off your sentence anyway.
But hang on, this was still the maximum that the magistrates could do.
Yes.
So you could frame this in one of two ways. You could frame it in the way that everybody is framing it, in the sense that people who don't know the difference between an indictable offence and a summary offence, they don't know the difference between these different kinds of court processes, go, well, why isn't there prison? Why isn't there a longer sentence? All these kind of things. Or you could frame it as, in the system of criminal justice that he was in, the magistrate's court, he was given the
maximum sentence.
He was given a maximum sentence.
Yeah.
He was given the highest sentence.
And I suppose in that case, you should question why it was that mode of trial, because it can be that this offence can be heard in the Crown Court.
Exactly. So why was it a summary offence and not an indictable offence?
Yeah. And the final point that the judge gave was that he would be vulnerable if put into into prison.
Yeah.
So if given a custodial sentence, he would be subject to abuse in prison.
Yeah.
And this is why it was a suspended sentence.
But then again, this kind of question, this kind of point about the protection of the perpetrator, the protection of the defendant, has been going on from time immemorial.
Yeah.
I can remember the two young boys who murdered James Bulger in the late 90s or early 2000s,
Yeah.
late 90s. They had their anonymity protected by the courts on the basis of a human rights challenge, on the basis of their right to life under Article 2 of the ECHR. And so this idea of protecting them from harm is something that has been part of the criminal justice system for years.
Yeah, but I think the sentiment changes with respect to that, depending on the type of person and the type of offense. Because similarly, there was a child that was convicted of a terrorism offense, incitement of terrorism overseas, and their anonymity was retained even after they turned 18 because of the nature of the offense. It was part of continuing a sort of pro-social rehabilitative approach.
Yeah.
So revealing the identity of this person would sort of undo the rehabilitation of getting rid of the criminal identity or the
stigma.
Yeah, exactly. So in terms of this kind of thing, I don't know how well the mitigating factors wash with people with regard to someone like Hugh Edwards and what he did.
Yeah, exactly.
And these kinds of balancing of interests and managing misinformation and misunderstanding as to the purpose of how criminal offenses function and how punishment functions is very difficult. And I think... Do you have anything else to say?
Yeah. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say that that's basically the heart of this episode.
Yeah, I think the point that I would make in this episode is that regardless of what you think about the early release scheme, about the Hugh Edwards sentencing, the most important thing, okay, you can agree or disagree with these different programs and policies, that at least come at them from a substantive, logical, unbiased perspective.
Yeah.
Don't come at this from the perspective of populism.
No.
Because it doesn't get you any closer to actually striking a point about the actual legitimacy of these kinds of policies. Because someone could come to me and make an argument that the early release scheme is a terrible idea. But they could make that argument on the basis of policy reasons, economic reasons, maybe social reasons, and that would be convincing, and that's worth having an engagement with. But if someone comes to me and says they're releasing criminals onto the streets and it's going to make the world a less safe place, then I'm not that convinced by those kinds of arguments because they're populist arguments.
Yeah.
And the same thing about Hugh Edwards. If someone makes the point to me that it should have been the case, there should be an appeal because it should have been the case that it had the opportunity to be an indictable offence.
Yeah.
Let's say all of the other similar cases of this nature are often treated as an indictable offence rather than a summary offence.
Yeah.
And therefore maybe has a harsher sentencing.
Yeah, this was uncharacteristic of that type of offence.
Yeah, that is a convincing argument for why this sentence wasn't particularly good.
Yeah.
But saying because he's a paedophile or because he's done this or done that or because he's a member of the mainstream media and all of these different kinds of things, they're protecting him.
There's like one rule for them and another rule for all of us.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of thing.
So I guess my concluding thoughts about pressure, politics and populism is that populism sucks.
Yes.
And populism doesn't really help with many good things. And these examples that we just pointed to are really good examples of stories that have taken place within the last couple of weeks
Yeah.
that are to do with penal populism that basically raise the same issue of a problem with populism.
Last few days.
Last few days.
Yeah.
That's quite
Very,
convenient.
very hot for me. I
Yeah,
think.
exactly.
I think my final point would be that I'm going to take your let's have a logical perspective and also add in that it's very important to recognize the emotive side of criminal justice because it deals with arguably the most difficult times of people's lives.
Yeah, definitely.
And there's a lot of tension and strife involved when a criminal offense occurs, such that when there's an appeal to victims or sort of fear or insecurity, that is like a very valid aspect of criminal justice and is part of sort of the harms that occur as a result of criminal offending. But obviously incorporating that into policy is very difficult, and taking the sort of easy approach through populism is not the way to do it.
No.
That's my final point, I think.
Okay. There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for listening. Next episode, well, we said we were going to do some more episodes where basically we do multiple episodes on a similar topic. So like a group of episodes. So we're able to go into a bit more depth on those topics rather than jumping around from here and there. So we'll start with that next episode. In a couple of weeks' time, I'll release a post about what that topic is going to be on and what we're going to talk about.
Cool.
And you've got a blog post that's coming out on this.
on this.
I've got a blog post that's going to be coming out on the Security Council, something that I have yet to do.
Hurry that up.
I know, exactly. I've not quite been on it with that. But other than that, I'd like to thank everybody for listening and stay tuned for the next episode.